everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of CADCA's Research into Action, our webinar series. I'm Carolina Deuce on CADCA's Evaluation and Research team. First, if you're only on the call, please join via Skype so you can view the presenter's slides. If you're in Skype and not hearing anything, sorry, you need to join the teleconference call. I have posted about that in the chat box, so hopefully you'll see that there and join the teleconference for the audio. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly remind all of the coalitions on this call to fill out the annual survey if you haven't done so already. CADCA uses the information gathered in the annual survey of coalitions to identify successful coalition strategies and determine what training and coalition development support community coalitions need. We have a prize drawing coming up for those who complete the survey by April 12th. You can see more about that on the slide here. And to get a survey link, please email survey@cadca.org. So the purpose of this webinar series is to introduce coalition members to current and relevant research being conducted in the substance abuse and community coalition fields. With that in mind, we've selected for this webinar the article Rethinking Addiction by Ewald, Dr. Robert Strack, and Dr. Muhsin Michael Orsini, who are all on the call today and will be presenting about the findings of their article, which discusses the effects of chronic stress on brain development in childhood and the risk of substance use in adolescents. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them in the chat box in Skype. There will be time for your questions after the author's presentation, so feel free to type any questions as you think of them. And then if you have any technical questions, you can also type them in the chat box and I will answer them. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Ewald, Dr. Strack, and Dr. Orsini to introduce themselves further and present their article's findings.
Well, that's coming up. I just want to thank everybody for allowing us to have this time with you. One of the things that we'll encourage you to do is to download the article. It just appeared in Global Pediatric Health in January, and in a minute you'll see the screen that allows you to download the article. Strongly encourage you to download it and take advantage of what's there, but we'll give you a nice synopsis today of what we wanted to share with you. So with us we have Rose Ewald. She's a master's student in public health education at UNC Greensboro in the School of Health and Human Sciences. I'm a professor in the Department of Public Health Education, also in Health and Human Sciences at UNC Greensboro in North Carolina. And with me also is Muhsin Orsini, who is one of my collaborators and an evaluation expert. So thank you for allowing us to join you today. So the link got sent out with the webinar call, so you can go ahead and click that live link to download the article. It's also within the PowerPoint, so you can always access it later and download it as well. We encourage you to share with anybody that'd be interested in this topic. We'll give you some talking points at the end. One of the things we want to start with is just recognizing CADCA's role in dealing with substance abuse and addictions within our communities. And we appreciate so much the value statement that CADCA has as its guiding mission, including its statement about a comprehensive approach to address individual environmental factors. This is certainly something that we believe in as public health professionals and what our research tries to resonate to. So what we want to talk about today is our article that really talks about the stress-related changes that play a significant role in addictions and substance use. We found that the physical and social environments where people live, work, and play have as much or more influence on health and behavior as our individual physical and physiological characteristics. So what we'll do is we'll provide a review of the pervasive effects of adverse early life experiences on behavior choices and health outcomes, and how these experiences drive the physiological response to our psychosocial stressors, which produce neurological changes in our brains and how we represent our world and relate to the stimuli coming into our world. So some of the key things for our agenda today will be to talk about the social determinants view of health, including addiction. To spend a little bit of time realizing that we are individuals embedded within environments. To talk about some of the key brain functions that we should be aware of as addictions workers. And to give you some talking points and some takeaways that you can share with people in your community, we're strong advocates that people like yourself need to be the advocates for the policymakers that are making decisions for your communities. So the extent that we can give you some ammunition, the better. Just like a farmer knows that to plant a field, they need to pay attention to all the conditions that moves a seedling from something that's not in the ground to the soil, to the water, to the minerals within the soil, to come up with a healthy plant. We'll be talking about humans and our need for the same nurturing environments to support healthy growth in the same vein. Something that you have probably been familiar with, so we're going to start with familiar terrain, is the social ecological model. And within this model, the individual is nested within a series of concentric circles that represents the environment that they're embedded. In this model, the individual is really the central point, and we look at those structures around them that might influence their behavior. By the end of this talk, we will have replaced the model with something slightly different, where our environment is at the center of our thought process relative to intervening on the human's health. So one of the things that we often talk about is the problem with just focusing on the individual or just focusing on the policy is if you just focus on the policy around the individual, you have a donut, and we're not paying attention to the individual. If you pay attention to just the individual, you've got the munchkin or the donut hole. And in our worldview, you really need to pay attention to the donut as well as the munchkin donut hole. So some of what we'll be talking about is exactly that, to help you think through strategies for talking others through both elements being important. So I'm going to ask Muhsin to talk with us about our first figure that is really a central guiding point of the manuscript.
So the social determinants of health encourage us to consider that health is affected by interrelated non-medical factors, including the physical and social characteristics of neighborhoods. And so what we're going to be talking about today is specifically how do the social determinants of health impact our behavior and our behavioral choices, and then lessons learned or implications to practice. So the social determinants of health challenge us to think about addiction and think about health behaviors in new ways. Certainly, certainly behavior matters in terms of health outcomes. Poor behavioral choices enhance the potential for poor health outcomes, and vice versa, right? Poor health outcomes limit the behavioral options and inhibit the ability to make healthy and behavioral choices. So the social determinants of health encourage us to look at the environments and how the environment that we're embedded in influences behavior and health. So the physical and social environment shapes and enhances our behavioral choices and options, and vice versa. So, for example, neighborhood attributes that affect physical activity rates of their population will also affect the risk for cardiovascular disease and diabetes, etc. Additionally, the psychosocial environment amplifies our health outcomes. For example, mental and physical health is impaired as a result of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, especially during critical developmental stages during while in the womb and during childhood. So how does the environment influence our health? And one way that happens is because of the effect of the environment on the physiological stress response. So the psychosocial environment has a direct effect on our stress response. So highly stressful environments keep levels of cortisol in our brains elevated, and then over the long term, constant exposure to elevated cortisol results in brain remodeling, especially during those critical periods. So, stress influences both behavior and health through affecting the way the stress response in our brain works, and over the long term, remodeling. So both behavioral choices and poor health outcomes are consequences of the physiological stress response and, of course, brain development. So Rose is going to talk to us. Rose is going to talk to us specifically about like the brain physiology and how our stress response impacts our brain and then therefore impacts our health. So she's going to talk a little bit about the limbic system, the HPA axis, and the endocrine system, as well as the endocrine system. Yep.
Okay. This is going to be a little bit technical, but I'm going to try to make it as clear as I can, so bear with us, and we're happy to answer any questions as we at the end. The prefrontal cortex is one of the areas in the limbic system in the brain that has to do with decision-making, cognitive function, and predicting outcomes based on our current choices. And then the amygdala, which is in the very center of the brain, also has to do with decision-making and memory and threats in the environment and the ability to wait for reward or go for immediate reward. Also has a lot to do with the fear response, so it can cause heightened anxiety and fear in certain environments. That's what it's supposed to do, is scan for that. And then the hippocampus, which is also in the center of the head, has to do with emotional context around our memories and our experiences, and it helps return the body to homeostasis after a stressful event. So these are the three structures of the limbic system that, just so you know where they're located in the brain, because these are the parts of the brain that are really affected by excess cortisol. So I wanted to make sure that we cover both pieces. And then in the very center, you'll see the pink, which is the glutamatergic neurotransmitters that actually connect the prefrontal cortex, where the receptors are, with the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is where the nerves originate. So there's a connection between those two areas of the brain. And perhaps the most important part is the dopaminergic neurotransmitters, which also originate in the amygdala and hippocampus. And they secrete the dopamine that gets sent throughout the brain. The most number of dopamine receptors, especially in adolescence, is in the prefrontal cortex. And so dopamine is the hormone that makes us like the experience we're having. It's the feel-good hormone. That's one of the reasons that during adolescence, our ability to refrain from certain activities is lessened, because the brain is actually saying, oh, I like that. That felt good. I want to do that again. And so these are factors that are affected by excess cortisol. And so in a stressful environment, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus actually shrink, and the amygdala is activated. It has greater activity, and it produces extra dopamine. So the fear response can be higher, but also the risk-taking activity will be higher, which we all know, teenagers, we can think of that. So then in the endocrine system of glands, we have the hypothalamus, which is in the very center of the head, and then the pituitary, which is right below it, and then the adrenal glands, which are actually on the top of each kidney. And these three together are known as the HPA axis because they work together. And so they produce the hormones that allow a behavioral and a physiological response. So the hypothalamus secretes corticotropin-releasing hormone, and that gets sent directly to the pituitary gland, and that causes it to secrete adrenal corticotropic hormone, which tells the adrenals to produce cortisol. And then the cortisol is what enables us to run really fast when that tiger jumps out from behind the tree or whatever other stress is in our environment. It allows us to respond to those stressors. So what happens is when we have enough cortisol and when we produce ACTH sufficiently, there's a feedback loop to the hypothalamus that says, I have enough, you don't need to produce any more. But in a stressful environment, that feedback loop gets interrupted, and what happens is that signal gets overridden by the hypothalamus. It says, no, there's stress in my environment, I have to keep producing cortisol because you have to keep running from that tiger. So even though the body says it has enough, that signal gets overridden. So The effect then is on the relative effect on brain structures is you can have a minimal and moderate and extensive effect depending on what part of what age you're at when the experience occurs. So physiological stress response during the prenatal period has an extensive effect on the brain, also during the childhood up to about age 12, and lessening effect during adolescence, and then a minimal effect during adulthood. So children and babies and adolescents are much less able to disregard or not be affected by the stress in their environment. Adverse childhood experiences have a significant physiological effect, including on the brain. And then substance use also has a equally significant effect on the brain during the prenatal period and during adolescence. I didn't put it in during childhood because most kids under 12 aren't significant users of substances, although that's starting to change. But I would anticipate it would have the same heightened effect as the prenatal and the adolescent period. If someone waits to start using substances until after about the age of 25, their risk of addiction is much, much lower because it doesn't have the effect on the brain structures. So what we found was intensive caregiving interventions have a greater effect on the brain and can actually reverse some of the damage if they're instituted at a very young age, like babies, newborns, children really, really young. There's a much greater effect. You can still have some of an effect on the brain during adolescence, but the ability for the brain to remodel is greater the younger the child is. So in addition to these experiential effects from the environment, we also have genetic effects which get greater with age. So the younger you are, the more your environment affects your health, and the older you are, the more your environment interacts with your genetics to have an effect on health. So this is kind of the other figure in the article, and this is kind of what it's supposed to represent. I realize it's complicated, but that was the intent of putting it in there, to summarize how everything interacts, and we can't consider one piece without looking at the whole picture. Okay, so targeted early interventions, what we found was that the strongest influence on the neural structures and neurobiological systems is the quality of caregiving that is received. There are a lot of randomized controlled trials, which I'll get to in a minute, but this was consistently what they found, that the structures in the brain were most affected by the quality of caregiving. There are detrimental effects on brain structures when the consistent, predictable, nurturing, responsive parenting is lacking. And so that's where the environment comes in. If the child is having adverse childhood experiences of, violence or drug use or food insecurity or homelessness, there are detrimental effects on the brain structure.
As another example of how environment plays a role in this, those detrimental effects also affect individuals who witness these negative events. So it doesn't actually even have to happen to them. Just being in a chaotic environment leads to brain remodeling.
Thank you, Ms. Singh. That's very true. That's very true. So the brain's neural systems exhibit plasticity, and it's possible to recover some of the lost functions if we do intensive, targeted, early interventions and adjust the environment. It's quite profound. The brain structures actually resemble the brain structures of the controls, the children that did not go through these stressful experiences. So some of the studies that we're going to list later, they actually they had a control group that was age and gender matched and other characteristics. And then they had a group of children or babies that had been exposed to a terrible environment of some kind. And they took some of those children, randomized them into an intervention. And then when they did the MRIs and CAT scans and PET scans and stuff, the brains actually had remodeled and repaired themselves so that the children that went through these intensive caregiving interventions, their brains actually looked like the children in the control group, which I thought was just astonishing. So these are the different studies. The Bucharest Early Intervention Project was the orphanages in Bucharest Then there were 70 years worth of additional institutionalized children studies where they did a meta-analysis on some of the interventions that had been done. The multidimensional treatment foster care for preschoolers program was specifically around foster care children. And then they also had the attachment and biobehavioral catch-up and the comparison of 3 different interventions. Those were done with children that were either at risk of abuse or being abused, and they were referred by Child Protective Services. Some of them stayed with their original biological caregivers, and some of them were put into foster care. And then the comparison of 3 different intervention methods, they actually ended up consolidating 2 of the 3 because there were no differences in the outcomes, but one of them, which was the caregiving intervention, showed significant effects. Some of the ways they measured this was by taking morning and evening cortisol levels, because the cortisol is supposed to have a diurnal rhythm where it's higher in the morning and lower at night. And what happens when you have this constant stress in the environment is that diurnal rhythm is lost. And so that peak in the morning and the dip at night that lets you go to sleep, that lets your body repair itself, that rhythm is lost, and that flattens out so that you don't have a peak in a valley. It's high all the time or it's low all the time, but you lose that rhythm. And that's how they're measuring whether their intervention is effective, because they can do biological specimens to see what the changes have been.
And summaries of these studies are all in the paper,
Yep.
including links to the references if you want to get more deep into each of the studies. But
Yeah.
going to our article can help you find ammunition and evidence to convince other people of what you're learning today.
And these were all randomized control trials, which is the gold standard in research, so people shouldn't be able to argue with what you're telling them.
Right.
You know, it wasn't just because we thought they seemed like they were behaving better. There's actually measurable differences in biological specimens.
So you might be asking yourself, what should I know?
Yeah. So studies provide a consistent evidence that support the brain's capacity to repair itself through these environmental interventions, but some of them occur during really critical developmental windows, like during the early childhood. You're developing the capacity to feel like you have agency in your environment, and if you are damaged during that time, it's difficult to recover that sense of efficacy. But these interventions actually showed that there was an effect on the brain. And then also, because of the brain plasticity, when you reduce the constant cortisol and keep it from being elevated all the time, that HPA axis repairs itself and it reverses the effect on the brain structures. So the actual brain structures go back to looking like they should. The amygdala is no longer enlarged. The hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex don't have as much loss of gray matter. The brain will actually repair itself. So they look normal. And then one of the other striking findings was that siblings of substance users who currently didn't use drugs had the same biological changes associated with those early environmental influences. And so they found that if the interventions included the person's social support and the non-substance using relatives prior to them starting to use substances, that addiction behavior could be prevented. And because you're fixing the brain, right? You're repairing those predilections that will make you more susceptible to addiction. And then the physical and social environments should be included in addiction treatments. That's the obvious outcome. Because if you're just trying to get people to not use a substance, but their brain has been changed so that they're unable to have those decision-making abilities and the ability to resist immediate gratification or think through their behaviors, they have less capacity for doing the things you're asking them to do. If we intervene when they're really young and we repair the brain, they don't ever go down that road. They don't have any more risk of being an addict than someone that never went through those early childhood experiences that caused the damage. That's a lot, I know. So
some of what we want to give you are some talking points relative to the review that we've done and the information we've tried to provide. We feel the model is a good way to talk other people on that might not be as savvy as you are about the brain, physiological stress response on the brain, and how those things relate to our human behavior, and in this case, specific to addictions. So one of the first things we want you to take away is to remember that treatment focus needs to expand beyond the typical behavior health link and needs to include social determinants of health. Too often, especially in America, where it's individual agency, lift yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thinking, we need to modify other people's views about how, even though we know behavior and health are linked, other factors are also equally important to understand and address. We also want you to take away that chronic stress early in life and the brain's physiological stress response substantively alters the developing brain and the reactions to future stimuli and behaviors. So just knowing that helps us put a little bit more empathy towards those who are struggling with addiction and can help us explain the more complex dynamics at play, both in the environment and within the individual's brain. Re-emphasizing that early interventions that include physical and social environment components are going to be more successful at mitigating addiction behaviors, and that a comprehensive treatment model are required to improve the health of individuals and populations. This one sheet can be a useful print-off for you to talk with others who you're trying to move along to get them to expand their treatment modalities beyond just the individual and their own behaviors. So we've included the link again and encourage you to chase the link. And as we turn the corner towards questions and answers, we kind of revisit that model we had earlier of thinking about the kind of environment that we're providing for our young people relative to making sure that the environment is either going to be a toxic one or a healthy one that results in healthy growth. And with that, I will turn it back over to Carolina.
Thank you. That was a very informative presentation. If anyone on the call right now wants to ask some questions, please type them into the chat box on Skype. I'm going to start off with a few questions, but I will ask your questions following that. So my first question is, you were discussing toward the end of your presentation that early interventions can enable the brain to repair itself from the structural changes due to chronic stress. Could you provide any examples of some early interventions that coalitions could advocate for or implement in their communities? And actually, before you answer that, everyone who's asking about the slides, you will get them, I promise. I'm going to post them on the website after this webinar. All right, go ahead.
So you're asking for examples of an intervention that could be done that would demonstrate these repairs to the brain?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, if communities or if coalitions in their community want to try to implement some kind of intervention that will help at-risk youth, what kinds of interventions should they be looking at?
Okay, so an example would be in the multidimensional treatment foster care for preschoolers intervention. What they did was they taught the parents how to have consistent, positive, highly responsive caregiving. So they taught them how to understand what their child's needs were and how important it was for the child to have those needs met and to feel safe and loved and cared for. And what they found was introducing strategies to increase positive parenting, they not only improved the children's diurnal cortisol rhythm so that they lost that blunted loss of a peak in the morning, they regained the peak, but the parents also had a lower stress level. So they helped the parents gain coping skills for dealing with their children, and they did not see the same results in the children or the parents that were not in the intervention group. So it sounds really simple to say, well, we're going to teach these parents how to help their children feel safe and loved and how to respond appropriately and give them a nurturing environment. But that's actually what's required, and that's all that's required. So that's one example. And they measured that by taking urine samples and measuring their cortisol levels morning and evening, so they were able to see how effective that intervention was. Another intervention that helped, that could be done at a community level was they provided an intervention for the children as well as the parents with make sure I've got the right one. A standard intervention, community intervention, compared to psychotherapy or psychoeducational parenting. So there was a specific intervention. You can read about it in the study. Comparison of 3 intervention methods is what it's called in the paper. But the children that got that community standard intervention, where they were addressing the environment as well as the parenting, they showed that over the course of the study, their morning cortisol levels came down. They were elevated at the beginning. They came down to a more normal level, and they remained normalized even at a year post-intervention. So they were able to determine that there was a lasting effect that persisted after they did the intervention. Each of these interventions is a little bit different. The Bucharest orphanage intervention was these children were in cribs. They had very little interaction. They were fed, but they really weren't given any nurturing or attention or caregiving. And so when they did the intervention, they provided them with this interactive, caring, loving, stimulating environment and made them feel protected and loved. And they saw the same kind of thing, that the changes were measurable and they persisted after the intervention. It's going to depend on the community that you're in and the needs of the group that you're working with, exactly what that intervention would look like. But the consistent thing with all of them was that making that child feel safe and loved and cared for was the bottom line. That's what did it for all of them.
So just enhancing what Rose is talking about, one of the earlier slides we talked about the need for quality interventions, and some of what she's giving you are characteristics of what that might look like. In a lot of communities around the country now, you've heard of the ACEs program, Adverse Childhood Experiences, that are permeating our primary schools. Looking at those programs and making sure they're following some of the quality practices would be a good intervention strategy or advocating strategy for coalition members within your community. So making sure that any existing interventions or attempts are really espousing some of these aspects that make for the kind of intervention needed to help these young people and the parents and relatives surrounding young people.
I'm going to move to some audience questions now because I think some of them follow up well on this. Sean asks, is there an age we should be focusing on when trying to repair, mitigate the damage to the brain from toxic stress? He wants to know if we're looking at elementary or is that too late and it should be earlier than elementary school?
The best results were children under 3 years of age. The younger, the better. Newborns and infants less than a year, they had significant and permanent changes. They also did a follow-up with some children that were a year old or less at the original intervention. They followed them up between 3 and 6 years of age, and the corrections and the repairs to the brain were still in evidence even at that age. The younger, the better, because what you're taking advantage of is that because the brain is still developing, the body will automatically try to repair itself and be what it should have been, what that seed was originally intended to grow, right? And if you wait later, more of the brain structures have become permanent. The developmental window for affecting how they're developing and how they're finally structured has passed. So you can't reverse some of the changes. You can reverse some, but not all. So the younger, the better, because you're really getting in while the brain is still creating itself, and it really will try to fix itself.
So another question to follow up on this from Lisa, would these interventions to increase nurturing behaviors in parents as adults also apply to teachers and child care workers, since children spend so much time in those environments as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And your intervention would be even stronger if you had the parents, teachers, and the after-school caregivers or the nursery caregivers. If all of them had the same training and a intention, you could actually revolutionize how these children's lives would be, because they would get it from every direction.
It's a nice example of Lisa knowing that the social environment and the social determinants surrounding young people is critical. So good job, Lisa.
Yeah, excellent.
So another question, Viviana is wondering why, if siblings of substance users showed similar impacts in the brain, how did they escape substance use?
Well, We don't know that they wouldn't have started using later, right? And we just know that one of the siblings did and the others had not yet. We don't know if they would have started using later. But the point of that was that so often we're told that the brain changes happen as a result of the drug use. And what that study was showing us was that even in people who have not used substances, they have the same brain changes as someone who has, and they were raised in the same environment. So that goes to the point of the changes happen as a result of the stress response, and then the drug use or the substance use is a coping mechanism. It's compensating for the fact that the brain structures aren't right and they don't work like they're supposed to. So they're self-medicating in a way. And one of the studies, they actually did PET scans, I believe, and the people were substance users, and they had them use the substance while they were in the machine where they could look at the effect it had on the brain. And they actually found that the areas of the brain that were the most damaged, that the drug that, I think it was cocaine, the drug that they were using actually improved the function of that part of the brain, which is why they kept using it, because then it functioned better. But that's the opposite of how we're told that drugs work and why people use drugs. So that was a very interesting study. That's also in the paper.
So the damage, which is the context of this question, is the family environment, because we'll assume to be talking about a young child here, right? So the family and the community and the neighborhood environment creates some deficits in two different children, right? And now behavioral choices still matter, right? These children make different choices or genetically have different inclinations on how to cope with that deficit. Right. So as one child might choose to go to substance use, another child might choose other risk-taking behaviors, right, or maybe even healthy choices, like taking a yoga class or something.
Or
right?
might have different coping options available to them, might have a different teacher that's nurturing. So you don't want to get into the thought process that because someone has a certain environment, they're destined to become a drug user. That's not the point.
Not the point.
The point is that your risk or your propensity might be elevated because of these changes in these influences of your environment, the changes on your brain structure. But it's not default that you'll succumb. So it's obvious that most people don't succumb. It's a matter of understanding what are the relative options for coping that are healthier than drugs in this case. So it's not a formulaic where you can say because one adolescent experiences stress, the other adolescents are going to also be substance users.
Mm-hmm.
Great question.
We have a question from Kate about asking what your recommendations are regarding, I guess, I'm assuming screening children that might need intervention.
I think the screening would occur through the teachers, the parents, the social workers, Department of Public Safety, DHHS, wherever they're getting their care, because they're the ones that are going to be able to assess whether they're in an adverse childhood environment that's going to cause these changes. So part of it is educating them that they need to be aware to watch for kids that are at risk because of their environment. And for some programs, every child in it is going to be at risk.
And that's one of the beauties of the ACEs program that's kind of taken off in the last set of years. Is that it's exactly doing what that Kate is asking about. Of course, one of the things that you're picking up from us is that those screenings need to be done even earlier than elementary school. So some of those pre-K programs become essential for the kind of intervention and targeting and identification and screening that we're talking about here. And then, of course, you can extend it all the way back into the prenatal ward and the education that parents are receiving and making sure that parents are being brought on board to the importance of the environment for their early developing child before they even get to the preschool ages. So there are some strategies that are being pushed out there now, and I know that you're, I'm sure, aware of some of these efforts in your community, but the more you can advocate and bring some of this knowledge to those that are funding and or resourcing these programs, the better.
I mean, in short, the recommended screening procedures were a bit beyond the scope of our paper, but we love the question.
What you're thinking. It's great.
Because implied in this question is that, wow, we can identify a child's risk before they become an addict, right? Before there becomes
restructure interventions to help them.
Yeah, before they display a behavioral problem in the classroom. The audience members have learned that there's some deficits that are present that are increasing the risk of that child, and we can do something about it. So,
and it's exciting to have the research kind of point to these things that some of us know intuitively, but the evidence is really providing the structured answers around. But it's a connection of the hard sciences that we're congealing and presenting to you, along with the people on the streets advocating for these changes to be manifest in your communities.
And I would add to that the cortisol response it happens whether it is a real or a perceived stressful environment. So I might look at it and say, that doesn't seem like a bad environment to me. But if the child perceives it as threatening, the cortisol is going to be secreted. So some of it has to do with the subjective experience of the child, and that's an important thing to bring into it. But also the advantage of doing something to help these children repair their brains before they get to adolescence is that when you get to adolescence, then you're dealing with the dopamine receptors ramp up in the prefrontal cortex. There's much more of a willingness to take risks and to not wait for reward and to do sensation seeking, all the behaviors of the teenagers. It's because those dopamine receptors have amplified themselves, and now you've got a double thing to deal with. You've got brain damage from the cortisol that's making the processing be different, and you have an incentive to engage in behaviors that are really not safe. So the sooner, the younger, the earlier we can do it, the better chance they have of surviving their adolescence without starting to use substances. It's a payoff down the road for the early intervention. I hope that answered your question.
I hope so too. Tony has a question. Does this apply to heightened stress and anxiety levels occurring in highly competitive, high-achieving communities where kids feel they are never good enough? What are some mitigating interventions?
Yes, it could if the child is feeling stressed and pressured about measuring up, or if they're getting verbal or psychological feedback that they experience as they're not safe, they're not okay, their environment is threatening. If they're being punished because they don't make good grades or something like that, it absolutely would affect it. Some people thrive on stress, but that usually is something people say as an adult. That's not usually what little kids say.
All right, so now I have a question from CJ focusing on adults. CJ wants to know if you have any insight into how to help an adult whose cortisol rhythms are unbalanced due to early childhood trauma.
Yeah, that's a little harder because there's not as much of an opportunity to repair the brain once the brain finishes developing. So there may be lifelong effects from those early experiences. And in my experience, a lot of endocrinologists don't necessarily recognize adrenal fatigue or adrenal exhaustion as a result of living a life that has just constantly caused cortisol secretion. So I don't know of a way to repair the brain at once you're in adulthood. As far as the flattened response, that has been associated with major depressive disorder and some other psychological disorders. What they're finding is people with those diagnoses often have a flattened cortisol response, and people with a normal cortisol diurnal rhythm tend to they're not diagnosed with those conditions as frequently. So there definitely is a connection. I just don't know how to fix it once you're an adult. The articles I researched did not talk about that.
I think Christine wants
to add. I think I'm speaking more of a hypothesis here than an answer, only because I'm not convinced the answer isn't around, but we did not go there in our article. But this could be the reason. Like, we know physical activity is related to cortisol and dopamine. We also know, and one of the audience members actually asked a question about the relationship between physical activity and mental wellness.
Yeah, dopamine.
And so maybe,
cortisol.
so my hypothesis is that physical activity programs, stress reduction programs, coping programs in adulthood could help one cope with the early childhood deficits, even if they're unrepairable.
Yeah, so I think the question's a great one, a little bit beyond what we were trying to present to you, but I think it's the kind of thing we could like to continue to pursue, and I encourage the audience to also continue to pursue answers for.
It would be a great area for doing research. Like, are there interventions that will help adults regain that normal diurnal rhythm?
Right.
We aren't trying those, right? We're medicating. Here, take this pill. We're not trying to do an intervention that helps them feel safe in their environment so that the stress level will modify itself.
Correct.
Right? And that's really the intervention that's needed.
Nice question.
All right, we have another question from Kate. What would the speakers recommend as the best support for organizations that want to work toward building a trauma-informed community, and specifically in terms of resources or websites? And to follow on that, I was going to ask a question about if you have any other resources on the topic of ACEs or brain development that you would recommend to coalitions looking to address these issues in their community.
Well, the first question is showing up on a call like this, being part of CADCA, paying attention to what the research is telling us, using some of the resources we're trying to disseminate and distill for folks so that you can bring along people in your community. That's really where, we as public health people believe that our voice is best served. A lot of what we advocate for is trying to come up with solutions and strategies that are ecologically based so that we're not constantly treating people individual to individual. If you look at the healthcare settings and the healthcare system and healthcare reform and some of the things that are embodied within it, communities are being forced in many ways based on the law's rewrite to look at the health of the community rather than a fee-for-service person-to-person model. So I would encourage you to get in contact with those people who are driving those changes in your community and be a strong voice to look at what are some of these interventions that we can shape environments, not just put in services for individuals. And so I think CADCA, by its nature, by its mission as we started off, has this belief as we do. And so I think the more advocates we can have and the more ammunition we can have to bring to the table, the better.
And I would also say reach out to the universities in your area that are doing research on child and family development studies or public health studies. If they're doing some kind of an intervention and you could piggyback onto that to say, can we measure cortisol before and after these interventions? Or can you help us find a way to include the option of doing this type of intervention as part of your study? There might be a way to do something like that. I think the mindset with the funders that provide money to do these interventions, they want quick results, they want measurable, how are you going to know it worked? And there's a real resistance to things that pass a 1-year mark. But this kind of intervention takes time, and you may not see the results for a year or two where you can measure it and show the changes. You might see some changes starting during the first year. So part of it is educating the funders that, yes, these interventions work, and you can certainly use the ones that are referenced in the article, and read the papers that are referenced in the article. There's a ton of other research that I didn't include that are in the references in the article. Any of those also talk about how they did their interventions, how they got the funding, how they measured it, what they did. Those would be great starting points for coming up with a way to do something in your local community. And if you can show funders that this really is a good intervention and it really does work, I think going down that road, we will eventually start getting funding to do this type of intervention. And really, within 2 or 3 generations, we could totally transform the situation we're dealing with now, because we would be healing not only the children, but helping their parents parent differently, and then those children will grow up to parent differently. And it's a cascade effect.
There's another audience question from Aaron, so I like to circle back to what we were discussing just before this about adults. And Aaron wants to know, would CBT be an effective intervention for adults?
There certainly is a lot of research in which cognitive behavioral therapy has some positive impacts on mental health, for example, specifically depression. So, what I'm not aware of is the biology of how that happens. I'm not sure if that research is done, right? If someone looked at the relationship between CBT and cortisol levels, right? But we do know that CBT improves mental health. We do know that mental health is part of the picture here.
Right.
Remember, Rose was talking about our perceptions of stress, right? Even are impacting my wellness to a large part, as well as the actual physical environment I'm in. So I would assume so. Go ahead.
I would think so. I would like to see something that would compare the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy as an intervention for adults with dialectical behavioral therapy, where you're taught how to not be sucked into your emotions so much and how to step back from them, because that deals with the fear response and the perception of threat. It would be interesting to see which of those two therapies was most effective for adults, especially if you are also correlating it with cortisol before and after, and if there's a change in the diurnal rhythm. That gives you a physiological marker where you're not just looking at behavior or how somebody subjectively responds to how they're feeling. It's objective evidence, and funders like that. So I think anything you do should include measuring the cortisol before and after.
Yeah, Carolina, I will look for it. But SAMHSA has a document, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, that looks at the risk and protective. I think how I found it was I searched risk and protective factors for substance use. But anyway, one of the reasons why I like this document is because it goes by age, right? So focuses on childhood and then young adolescence, then adolescence, then adulthood, lists the risk and protective factors, but then also summarizes the research and gives the characteristics of effective programs that target substance use at those specific ages, which can help you, from an outsider perspective, judge the quality of interventions. And then if there was an evidence-based program, which is, kind of a higher standard that has shown to improve things, that's listed too. The reason why my memory got jogged of this is because I know CBT is in there.
Yeah,
right?
Because
CBT is recognized as an evidence-based practice for depression and substance use.
Just bear in mind, as you look at the programs, these programs or interventions that's geared towards the individual, based on our evidence, will be more effective if we include the environment surrounding them and the social support surrounding them. So going back to it's fine to intervene on the individual, but intervening on the donut surrounding the donut hole or the munchkin is also critical. So think about how your modalities of intervention can be multimodal, both at individual and environmental levels.
And it's really important to bear in mind that the child may not be the one who is being hit, but if they're watching their sister or brother or their mother or father get beaten up, they are being traumatized. And they will have a physiological stress response just as if it had happened to them. So it's important to include the siblings of anyone that might come into your programs, because otherwise we're leaving a whole group of people out there that are at risk because of the effects of cortisol, even though they're not substance users yet. And what to Dr. Strack's point, we're trying to keep people from jumping in the river, not just pull them out of the river once they come down to the point where we're standing. So we want to look at the upstream factors that are causing people to turn to this substance use as a response, not just treating them once they're substance users. These are all really great questions. And I would just like to say thank you for everyone that joined on the call. And if you have any questions when you read the article, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to have a conversation with you. I know it's complicated, but like we're really wanting to support you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Strack, Rose, Ewald, and Dr. Orsini for sharing your work with us. We really appreciated hearing about this fascinating material, and hopefully we'll be able to find ways to implement and advocate in our communities. Thanks to all the coalition members who had such awesome questions. Speaking of which, there's another question, how to reach the speakers. I believe that Rose Ewald's email is in the article, so if you click the link to download the article, you'll be able to get it there. I'm not sure if they want to also offer that somewhere else. Another thing, I know some people have asked about it previously. If you want a letter of participation for this webinar, you need to email me, and my email is kduth@cadca.org, and I'm going to throw that in the chat box.
And the email for Dr. Strack and I is also on the slide of the presentation.
Oh. Contact the presenters. Once these slides are posted, you'll be able to look in the beginning of the slides and find some email addresses. Last minute call, are there any more questions for our lovely speakers?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and we applaud all the hard work being done out there in our communities.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, it looks like there's no more questions, so we'll end here. Again, thank you to the presenters and thank you to everyone for attending. One last notification, I will be posting the slides on the website. I will also post I will send out the link to the article again because I believe someone else requested that. And then to reiterate, if you want a letter of participation, you need to email me, kduth@cadca.org. And I put my email in the chat box.